The potential of American military intervention in Iran has moved from the realm of theoretical contingency to operational planning, as President Donald Trump assembles what he terms a massive armada in the Persian Gulf. All the while, he has issued Tehran an ultimatum: submit to Washington's demands or face military action far worse than June's devastating strikes on Iranian nuclear facilities. This escalation follows Trump's bold January 3rd operation in Venezuela, where U.S. Special Forces extracted President Nicolas Maduro from his fortified compound in Caracas, establishing a precedent that has fundamentally altered calculations in Tehran. The question facing policymakers and analysts is no longer whether regime change in Iran remains on Washington's menu of options, but rather whether the strategic, operational, and political conditions exist to execute such an undertaking, and what kind of global order emerges from the attempt. The architecture of confrontation between Washington and Tehran carries historical weight that extends far beyond the 1979 revolution. American involvement in Iranian regime change is not unprecedented. The CIA orchestrated Operation Ajax in 1953 overthrew democratically elected Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh, installing Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi and creating grievances that fuel Iranian political discourse 7 decades later. This historical memory shapes how Tehran interprets current American intentions, transforming Trump's threats from mere diplomatic pressure into existential warnings. The Islamic Republic's survival strategy has been constructed explicitly to prevent a repeat of 1953, building up redundant security apparatuses, cultivating regional proxies, and maintaining strategic ambiguity about nuclear capabilities, all designed to make regime change prohibitively costly. The current Trump administration has issued 3 non-negotiable demands: complete cessation of uranium enrichment with disposal of existing stockpiles, severe limitations on Iran's ballistic missile program, and termination of support for regional proxy networks including Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis. These demands, combined with the deployment of the USS Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group and potential dispatch of a second carrier, signal that Washington views military action as increasingly viable. The timing coincides with Iran's domestic fragility. Nationwide protests beginning in late December 2025 resulted in what state media acknowledges at least 5,000 deaths, though independent monitoring suggests the toll exceeds 10,000. Trump's public statements encouraging protesters to keep protesting, take over your institutions, represent a direct call for regime overthrow, something that's unprecedented in recent U.S.-Iran relations. Yet the Venezuela operation that emboldens this approach simultaneously reveals the fundamental limits of American power projection. Operation Absolute Resolve succeeded in extracting Maduro because Venezuela represented an ideal target for decapitation strikes, a personalist dictatorship where power concentrated in a single individual, military forces dependent on Cuban protection rather than local institutional loyalty, and economic infrastructure that had already collapsed through mismanagement. The operation required months of CIA infiltration, detailed intelligence on Maduro's movements and security protocols, advanced positioning of naval assets, and construction of full-scale training mock-ups of the presidential compound. Even with these preparations, the raid killed approximately 80 people, including civilian casualties and Cuban security personnel, generating international controversy about violations of Venezuelan sovereignty and messy collateral damage. Iran presents very different challenges. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps commands at least 150,000 soldiers with extensive combat experience from Syria, Iraq, and Yemen, supported by the besieged militia's additional forces numbering in the hundreds of thousands. Unlike Venezuela's hollowed-out military, the IRGC operates a vast business empire worth billions of dollars in construction, telecommunications, and exports, giving commanders tangible personal stakes in the regime preservation regardless of ideological commitment. Iran's mountainous terrain and dispersed urban centers would make any ground operation resemble not the quick Venezuelan raid, but rather the prolonged entanglements in Iraq or Afghanistan, precisely the forever wars that Trump campaigned against. The absence of clear succession mechanisms means removing Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei would not automatically produce regime collapse, potentially yielding instead into a more hardline IRGC-dominated government or territorial fragmentation along ethnic, loyalty, or religious lines. The sheer distance to the target also raises refueling concerns, something which the proximity of Venezuela didn't call for. The great power dimension introduces additional complications absent from the Venezuelan scenario. Russia and China have signed comprehensive strategic pacts with Iran in February 2026, creating coordinated defense planning and intelligence sharing mechanisms. While stopping short of NATO-style Article 5 mutual defense guarantees, this trilateral alignment means any U.S. military escalation in Iran risks broader strategic responses from Moscow and Beijing. China imports 91% of Iranian oil exports, making Tehran's stability directly relevant to Chinese energy security, while Russia views Iran as essential to its Middle Eastern influence, especially following the Assad regime's collapse in Syria. Both powers condemned U.S. strikes on Iranian nuclear facilities, but provided limited material support, suggesting willingness to sacrifice Iran for larger strategic interests. Yet a full-scale regime change operation could cross red lines that targeted strikes did not. Neither Russia nor China appears prepared to mount military intervention on Iran's behalf, constrained by their own strategic priorities and Iran's inability to pay for advanced weapons systems that it desperately needs. Moscow's military-industrial capacity remains stretched by the Ukraine conflict, while Beijing maintains traditional reluctance to deliver game-changing hardware to high-risk clients. However, both powers have provided technologies crucial to Iran's ability to suppress domestic dissent. Chinese surveillance systems and facial recognition networks, for instance, enabled the brutal crackdown that crushed January's protests. This pattern suggests Moscow and Beijing might accept regime change as fait accompli while ensuring successor governments remain within their economic orbit, particularly regarding energy exports and Belt and Road connectivity. Regional actors present equally complex calculations. Gulf Arab states might publicly maintain neutrality while reportedly providing intelligence support for Israeli operations against Iran. Yet they actively oppose American military strikes that could destabilize energy markets or trigger Iranian and proxy retaliation against their territory. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, and Oman have increased diplomatic engagement with Tehran even as they coordinate with Washington on other Middle Eastern issues, hedging against Iranian collapse scenarios that could unleash sectarian warfare or refugee flows. Israel's interests diverge from Gulf preferences. Netanyahu's government views Iranian regime change as potentially resolving the nuclear threat permanently, though Israeli officials acknowledge air power alone cannot topple the clerical system. This creates coalition management challenges where Washington's closest regional partners harbor conflicting preferences about optimal outcomes. The economic dimensions extend beyond immediate military costs. Iran's threatened closure of the Strait of Hormuz, through which 20% of global oil trade transits daily, would spike prices toward $100 per barrel and disrupt liquefied natural gas markets dependent on 90 billion cubic meters of annual transit. While Saudi spare capacity could partially offset Iranian supply disruptions, the psychological impact on markets would persist throughout any regime change operation and its aftermath. Trump's fixation on accessing Venezuelan oil reserves following Maduro's removal suggests similar expectations regarding Iranian hydrocarbons, though the complexity of restarting Iran's sanctioned energy infrastructure dwarfs Venezuela's challenges. The precedent of appropriating defeated states' natural resources to reimburse American intervention costs raises profound questions about 21st century economic warfare and resource sovereignty. The most fundamental obstacle to Iranian regime change lies in the absence of a viable succession plan. Unlike Venezuela, where opposition leader Maria Corina Machado enjoyed clear popular legitimacy that Trump's administration then chose to sideline, Iran's opposition landscape remains fragmented between monarchist supporters of Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi, secular Democrats, ethnic minorities seeking autonomy, and reformist factions within the current system. Washington has provided no indication which faction it would empower or how it would navigate the inevitable power struggles following regime collapse. The Iraq experience, where insufficient planning, conflicting objectives, limited diplomatic capacity, and unrealistic timelines produced decade-long instability, looms large over current deliberations despite Trump's claims that America would, quote, run the country temporarily as in Venezuela. Intelligence assessments conclude that while January's protests weakened the Iranian government, they did not create major fractions in regime cohesion or loyalty among security forces. The conditions producing popular unrest, economic crisis, inflation, and energy shortages, among others, do persist and will continue generating periodic instability, but spontaneous protest movements historically fail to achieve regime change without either military defections or external intervention coordinating opposition forces. Neither condition currently exists in Iran, and Trump administration officials have not articulated clear guidance on what U.S. military action would aim to accomplish beyond vague references to creating conditions for regime change rather than direct toppling of the system. This ambiguity reflects deeper uncertainties about whether Trump pursues regime change as a strategic objective or as negotiating leverage to extract concessions on nuclear enrichment, missiles, and proxy support. The oscillation between threatening something very tough and pursuing indirect negotiations in Oman through Iranian security chief Ali Larijani suggests internal administration debate between maximalist and transactional approaches. Secretary of State Marco Rubio's statement that
I'm not sure you can reach a deal with these guys, but we're going to try to find out. We don't see there's any harm in trying to figure out there's something that can be done. This is a president that always prefers a peaceful outcome to any conflict or any challenge.
Encapsulates this uncertainty. Congressional resistance, manifested in war powers resolutions introduced by Senators Tim Kaine and Rand Paul, further constrains presidential freedom of action, though similar legislation failed to prevent June's nuclear facility strikes, for which no real consequence manifested. The strategic logic favoring military intervention rests on several premises: that Iran's nuclear program poses unacceptable proliferation risk following its accumulation of sufficient 60% enriched uranium for 9 weapons, that the regime's weakened regional position following proxy degradation creates a window for decisive action, that domestic unrest indicates fundamental illegitimacy, and that Venezuelan success demonstrates feasibility of decapitation operations. Each premise contains validity yet also carries flaws. Nuclear strikes already obliterated key facilities without eliminating Iran's technical knowledge. Proxy degradation increases rather than decreases nuclear acceleration incentives, protest suppression demonstrated regime resilience rather than brittleness, and Venezuela's unique vulnerabilities do not translate to Iran's distance and institutional depth. The countervailing logic emphasizes regime change operations' dismal track record in the Middle East, where Libya, Iraq, Syria, and Yemen descended into prolonged conflicts following leadership removal. The absence of international legitimacy for unilateral military action, the risk of triggering rather than preventing Iranian nuclear weapons development as a last resort deterrent, and the potential for regional tensions involving Israel, Hezbollah remnants, and Gulf states. The congressional coalition opposing unauthorized Iranian interventions, spanning 25 advocacy groups and bipartisan Senate sponsors, argues that Iran has neither attacked the United States nor threatened offensive strikes, negating legal justification for preemptive war. The most likely trajectory remains a prolonged crisis characterized by periodic military strikes, alongside escalating sanctions pressure, intermittent negotiations, and opportunistic exploitation of domestic Iranian instability, rather than comprehensive regime change operations. This approach allows Washington to maintain maximum pressure while avoiding the catastrophic risks and resource commitments that full-scale intervention would demand. Trump's comparison of Iran to Venezuela serves primarily as psychological warfare intended to convince Tehran of American resolve and protesters of imminent external support, rather than an operational blueprint. The fundamental question facing Tehran is whether to accept limitations on nuclear and missile programs through negotiated settlement or risk military action that destroys infrastructure without guaranteeing regime survival. American policy towards Iran stands at an inflection point where the costs of inaction, potential nuclear breakout, continued regional destabilization, and humanitarian catastrophe from protest suppression must be weighed against intervention's unpredictable consequences. The Venezuela operation proved that Trump will employ military force against sovereign governments for objectives like resource access and domestic political messaging. Whether this precedent extends to a nation of 89 million with genuine military capabilities, great power patrons, and retaliatory options spanning from Hormuz closure to cyber warfare remains the central question of 2026's most dangerous confrontation. The answer will determine not only Iran's trajectory but also the viability of international law constraints on the use of force in an era where superpower prerogatives increasingly override multilateral frameworks. As with the threshold war dynamics in the Iran-Israel conflict, the regime change question is a test of whether 21st century crisis management mechanisms can contain escalation when decision-making timelines compress and diplomatic off-ramps narrow. or whether the international system lurches towards conflicts that it sought to prevent. If you found this video informative, please click like and consider subscribing for more analyses. This has been the Ergo Report, wishing you a peaceful week ahead.